Welcome back to my 13 horrifically silly days of Halloween, and today I have my friend Conor McCreery here. Conor, please introduce yourself to everybody and tell us about your background, specifically in writing graphic novels.
Well, you see, my career started. Sorry, I don't know what that was really weird. A weird fart in
Yeah,
my throat. Must
yeah,
have been Halloween. No, so my name is Conor McCreery. I'm a comic book writer. I write a little bit of film and television as well. Reagan and I met each other many, many, many moons ago, back when we both worked in the Canadian film industry together, and I got pulled in quite happily into the world of Triple Take Productions and have done a lot of really fun stuff with her.
mhm,
But when I'm not kind of following Reagan's directions to eat sheep brains,
yep.
um, true story in a graveyard.
Oh,
Um,
pig brains, though.
Pig
No,
brains? Oh, I thought they were
actually,
sheep
yours might have been
brains.
sheep.
I
Yeah,
thought I
no,
got the sheep.
I,
I had
I
an
got
order
I
in.
got pig brains later. This is for Space Zombies, 13 months of
Ah,
brain spinning mayhem we're talking about here.
yeah.
Connor was Lord of the Zombies, which is like your defining role, right?
It really, in my career, I mean, if you
Yeah.
check my IMDb, it's pretty much still the only reason I have an IMDb is because I have a role in 13 months of brain spinning mayhem. So after that, I worked in film and TV, but I'm a comic book creator. I created a series called Kill Shakespeare,
Yeah,
which if you like Game of Thrones and you like Shakespeare, it's kind of that mushed together.
nice.
I've also worked on brands like Assassin's Creed or Adventure Time, regular show, and I've got a new spooky story that's going to start coming out. I guess at the very beginning of next year, I believe January 6th is the first issue of something called The Last Witch, which
Okay.
is all about a young girl in post-famine Ireland whose village gets wiped out by witches. And it's up to her, her grandmother, and her little brother to go on a quest to try to keep these witches from ending the world.
Interesting. Okay, very cool. So tell us more about how The Last Witch came into being, and anything you can tell us that isn't giving too much away.
Oh, for sure. Actually, The Last Witch was a short story I wrote for a friend of mine who was doing a fundraiser for a children's home in Nova Scotia. And so he'd reached out to people in the comics industry and a couple of Mag Story, who some of you may know because she's a pretty prolific horror and romance writer, and asked us to submit something. And I had mostly worked in comics, but I thought, hey, it might be fun to do this short story. And so the short story started about this girl, Saoirse, who goes off into the woods on Imbolc Day, which is basically the equivalent of Groundhog Day,
Yeah,
except
it's
in
my birthday.
Ireland. Oh, Imbolc, really? I didn't know that.
It is. Yeah.
Oh,
Mhm.
very cool. Well, in Ireland, the it's not about a groundhog seeing his shadow; it's about this witch, the Callie.
Mm.
And if it's sunny, it means that winter is going to be coming, and it's sunny because she needs to be able to find wood for her fire to stay warm through the winter, and presumably to roast and eat children.
Yeah.
And so that's what happens on this day. She's told, don't go out. It's sunny. The witch will be about. Her and this other little boy have this competition to go deep into the woods to prove how brave they are. And it goes horribly, horribly wrong. And so, yeah, it was a short story that I had always kind of liked. And an editor friend of mine had said, well, do you have any stories you want? I'd work with them on Adventure Time and regular show at this company called Boom. And my editor said, well, do you have some other things you'd like to do? I enjoyed the process. And so I sent a bunch of them. And really, I just sort of said, oh, there's this short story, and here's, a 2 sentence description. She was like, that's the thing. And so, yeah, and so since now it's kind of expanded. It'll be 2 books at least. And yeah, it's a lot of, I mean, if you like things like Secret of Nim or The Dark Crystal or kind of, Grimm's fairy tale, I mean, it's a classic Celtic fairy tale in the sense of, scary things happen. Not all the good people get good results, but at the same token, it's still really something that hopefully like an 11 or 12-year-old could pick up and enjoy and just maybe have some like, oh, like that the witch ate somebody, So yes, there's a little child cannibalism in the first issue.
Oh, nice. Mm.
More of the second, really.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, then that's
Start
so
them
much better.
soft. Start them soft and slow. But yeah, no, it's a lot of fun. I've had a great deal of. It's a new thing for me to do, kind of a 2 book series. So it was a really interesting trying to figure that out. And yeah, I mean, with COVID, this was something that was supposed to have been out. Oh gosh, maybe almost a year ago now. But everything just got pushed back. So we're really happy to get it out now.
And speaking of its Celtic themes, I assume must have been interesting. You were already probably very aware of your own ancestral roots, or would be interested getting to know some of the folklore around that. I'm assuming you have Celtic background there by
I
the
do.
color of your beard and your last name.
I do. I do. My dad was born in Dublin, so I've
Yeah.
always loved Irish fairy tales. I mean, I got a bunch of those books when I was kids from my family in Ireland, and I think they shaped a lot of my storytelling because, again, they're harsher fairy tales. The heroes often lose. There is there is violence. Like they are not happy stories always, and so that always influenced the kind of stories I liked, and I guess the kind of horror I liked. And yeah, it was definitely neat doing research on it. It was funny because at the same time as this started, another project that I've been working on for a long time called Trickster, about a kind of more of a about a leprechaun who lives in modern day society, but the original vision of leprechauns, who are the children of the sun god. So he hates all the trappings of fake Irish culture because leprechauns have been reduced to these tiny little guys who want to steal your pot of gold. And he's,
Yeah.
he's 5'9", man. Like the dude,
Okay.
and so, but basically, in that story is about, as a leprechaun, he has the ability of illusion, so he can change the way you see reality. Generally, it's on him, but I mean, if he wanted to convince you, he could convince you that the room you're in is suddenly filled with water, and it would be so convincing that your heart and your brain and your lungs would believe you were drowning.
And you drown,
And so
right?
really, it's a story about a guy who uses these powers to kind of help the little guy. He kind of has his little corner of the city where he's been living hidden away from the homelands. And he kind of protects the little guy whatever he can. He works with a local priest. He kind of is a thorn in the side of like greedy developers or, thugs and things like that.
Right.
But at the end of the first book, his past and this long forgotten war in the fairylands starts to catch up with him. So it's funny. I was kind of researching both of these projects at the same time, and
Right.
people read them both. You'll see there is a little bit of overlap. There's some references to each series and the other in terms of characters or names or just historical, or I guess fictional historical happenings of the
Yeah.
fairylands.
Yes. Yeah. Historical, mythological stuff. And okay, so do you by any chance know why leprechauns were reduced to that? I'm just thinking of the movie Leprechaun, even though it's trying to be a horror, or sorry, it's being a horror for those of you who like Leprechaun. Sorry. Um,
I mean, the first one's
um,
not horrible.
no, it's not. It's like they're small even there, right? So
Yeah.
where did that happen? Where did they
I,
get?
you know, that's it's an interesting question because leprechauns are like the etymology of the world is the son of Lu, and Lu, and I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. It's probably more of an sound to it,
Yeah.
but and that's the sun god. That's the Irish sun god. And so one of the reasons why leprechauns were apparently so taken with gold is because gold was thought of as a physical manifestation of the sun on earth. That's why it
Neat.
shone so brightly. And so, being the children of the sun god, this is why leprechauns love gold. And they'd always had a reputation of being mischievous and tricksters and greedy and things like that.
Okay.
Where they went from being sort of a member of the Fae and, sort of like, would have been a taller, more, they were meant to originally have been kind of very good looking, like most of the fairy, Irish fairies are,
Mhm.
often with, red hair because of their notion of being of the sun god. So that's where the red hair thing came in.
Neat.
But exactly when they went from being these kind of tall, good-looking children of sun god trickster types who had this affinity to gold and became as near as I can tell, it ended up kind of being a bit of a marketing thing, the idea. But it's interesting. There's no like clear like, oh yeah, this is when, because they were actually a pretty minor, like they're not a major part of Irish mythology. They've
Okay.
become a much bigger part of Irish mythology because of the fact that somehow they became popularized, for Lucky Charms and things like that.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. Someone out there drew a little guy one time, I guess, with a little buckle in his hat, and
Mhm.
did not get the royalties, or she did not get the royalties they deserve. But so yeah, we're taking leprechauns back. It's actually funny because every time we try to pitch the story, we're like, oh yeah, it's about a leprechaun, and people are like, what? Like, no, okay, so maybe we just say it's about an Irish fairy. They're like, yeah, say that. We're like, but it is about a leprechaun. So we're still working that out. It's cool. It's cool leprechauns.
Right.
He's not that cool. He's kind of like Mal from Serenity. Like he
Nice.
leads his
Yes.
team, but he's a good guy who gets a lot of crap from his team. So it's fun.
Right. Right. Cool. That sounds excellent. Especially with the Serenity reference in there. Firefly.
Know your audience.
Yes. Now, going back to the Last Witch, sort of druidism, is that the kind of thing that like the witch falls under, or is that strictly other stuff?
I mean, there is a little bit. There is a reference to a character being like a green witch, and the green
Okay.
witches are witches who have plant magic and know, and a lot of their magic kind of consists of what you and I would just call like, yeah, horticulture, like having a deep knowledge of
Yeah.
what plants do.
Yes.
Um, but I don't want to spoil too much, but there are instances where it expands past just, oh, I can make potions.
Mhm.
The grandmother can make a potion that helps her daughter breathe underwater. It actually plays a lot with elements. I mean, I've always loved that trope of magic where, you've got magic that corresponds to each of the elements. And so the witches that, there's kind of the Kaliak, who is the head witch that our hero Saoirse must ultimately face. But to kind of get to her and to gain her powers, she has to kind of pass these four sisters who are the handmaidens of the Kaliak. And originally the project was called Witchmark because the main character Saoirse has this strange birthmark. And when she has this first encounter with a witch is when the power of that birthmark is uncovered to her. And it
Okay.
changes her life and her destiny, and gives her a tool she can use to fight these sisters. So we play a lot with, we play a lot with each sister kind of being connected to an element, not unlike something like Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Yeah.
For Avatar fans, I would say actually, there's probably, I was watching a lot of Avatar with my kids at the time, so I'm sure there is a lot more Avatar influence in there than I recognize, but
Yeah.
definitely that's an obvious one. I was already thinking on the lines of elemental magic, and I think probably watching Avatar in some way subconsciously solidified that as, oh yeah, it's an easy organizing principle as an audience member for you to understand, and it's like, oh, as our hero gains mastery of the elements, it kind of makes it, it also divided the story up nicely of like, oh, like we're going to deal with water and fire and air. And
Yeah.
yeah, and there's, definitely some light horror. There's definitely Irish zombies, the
Oh,
bogmen, as they call them. Um, there are shape changers. There is a bunch of monsters from Irish mythology make appearances. So I would say, yeah, it's definitely horror for kids, but also if you just like a dark fairy tale, then it's horror for adults as well. Without ever kind of, it's not a slasher thing. It's not cruelly violent, except for perhaps the one kid who gets eaten early in the story. That's tough for Padraig. Padraig takes an L.
okay.
Um, but yeah, and it's really meant to, like, if you love those kind of fairy tales, if you love that kind of thing where you can, and it's a coming of age story as well, because this is a 12-year-old girl who has been told that, hey, 12 is the time when your life is going to change. And when she discovers the witch mark, suddenly realizes what this change is about. And so there's a bit of a metaphor, I guess, for going through puberty, and a bit of a, and it's also about having to leave your parents behind and
Yeah.
having to start making your own decisions.
Right. Very cool. And
It's got layers. It's got
layers,
layers.
layers.
Layers upon layers.
Yeah.
But
Well, it
it's
sounds like
drawn by V Glass. I don't give just it's drawn by V Glass, who's a British artist, and they are absolutely fantastic. I wish I knew Zoom well enough to be like, hey, I'll share my screen, but I'm a dummy. But they've done like such an incredible job. It is the prettiest comic I've ever been privileged to work on, because V's work is so exceptional. And the coloring is just starting to come in now, and it's amazing. I'm so happy with how it's turning out.
again, it's being released in January, the first
Yeah,
issue.
the first issue is January 6th. There's going to be 6 issues. It was originally going to be released as a graphic novel, but because of COVID, in a way to kind of help comic shops, one thing said for comic shops is having like a regular draw. So it's going to be released over 6 issues. They're all going to be all random sizes. They're going to be very thick comics. Normally, comics like 22 pages. Some of
Yeah.
these will be double that.
Mm.
So the first 6 issues will be released through the first half of next year, and I believe the first book will be collected sort of by the end of the summer.
Mhm.
And then we'll start releasing. We're not 100% sure, depending on where the world is at that point. We may release the second half as issues as well, or we
Okay.
may just go to a second book. And then, yeah, I guess depending on how many people, how the reaction is, we plotted out the next possible chapter of the story and the adventure that comes next. So yeah, please go out there if you like this sort of thing. If you like the art, you're going to be now seeing probably at this very moment as
Yeah.
Reagan
Well,
patches it in afterwards. If you like what this looks like, you can definitely track it down. And if you're interested in anything about that sort of stuff, at the end, I'm sure we'll give all my information, but you can generally find me as Conor McCreery on Facebook and Twitter.
perfect. All right. Now, switching gears, as I do with all of my interviews, I like to find out your favorite B movies, horror comedies, and such like that. So let's talk about your favorite B movie first of all, or perhaps you have one, a favorite that's older and a favorite that is more recent. And I know we likely talked about this last year during the Space Zombies reunion, but let's rehash a little.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess it would be remiss to not start off about 13 months of brain spinning mayhem.
Oh, is that
I, you know,
Space
I'm,
Zombies
I'm,
your favorite?
I'm very biased. Well, I mean, it's the only one I've ever been in. So, I mean, I definitely have a soft spot for it. But no, I mean, I think, for the audience who has seen 13 months, I think like that's a really good encapsulation of sort of what makes B movies fun, right?
Yes.
Like it's I mean, I mean, the biggest difference, of course, is 13 months knows what it's doing and
Yeah,
knows what the end result is going to be.
know what
And
we're
some B
supposed to
movies, you get a sense that yes, they also knew, and some part of the hilarity is just this notion that nobody involved has any sense that this is not Ben-Hur or something like that.
Yeah,
I mean,
i.e.
Ed
Ed
Wood,
Wood stuff, which is what a lot of Space Zombies is based on. So yeah.
yes, yes. I mean, and Ed Wood is, and Ed Wood, even if you look in his career, I feel like as he went more deeply into his career, he became aware of what he was making and he kind of leaned into his own tropes.
Mhm.
But I'm trying to think like Plan 9 was kind of one I actually hadn't seen it until we did 13 months and then I went and watched Plan 9. I mean, that is, it is a classic. There's a reason why it's so much fun.
Totally.
I think like Meet the Feebles is a B movie. If you call that a B movie, like a lot of
Yeah, I would, and it's like I'm obviously aware of what it is, but like people might clarify and say cult movies, but I tend to lump cult movies with B movies. So yeah, absolutely, Meet the Feebles by Peter Jackson.
yeah, like a lot of Peter Jackson, a lot of his early stuff is kind of funny, bad taste.
Yep.
It's funny because I'm not, I'm definitely not a splatter horror fan. When here's my deep confession. I've never seen a Halloween,
Oh,
never seen a Friday the 13th.
wow.
I've never seen Poltergeist.
Ooh.
Um, I know, right? Like when I was a kid, I was deathly afraid of these movies. I just was so convinced that I think had convinced myself that they were far, far scarier than they actually were. Because the only chunk I've seen a chunk of one of the Friday the 13th at my friend's house. Because they like kind of set me up. They're like, oh, we're gonna watch this other thing. And I showed up, on Friday the 13th and I watched for like a little bit. And then I was like, I got it. But it wasn't so much that it was like super scary. I was worried about what was coming next. I think the suspense. So that's kind of my bend, is things that like. I mean, what I like about horror, um, and now I mean, I'm a little more, I can handle the gore a little bit more. But it's never been my thing. Like now that I'm like, oh, I can handle it. I'm like, it's funny. What I love are the suspense. I love the waiting for the scare,
Yeah.
but I'm really badly suited temperamentally for waiting for a scare. Like I get antsy. Like
Yeah.
you know, um, so like kind of the horror that I've been watching most is stuff like say like Green Room. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's like
I don't know.
it's a story about like a punk band that ends up doing this show at this like white supremacist bar,
Ooh.
and they see something they shouldn't and they barricade themselves in the green room, right? Like the room for talent before they go on. And it's about like, so it's half horror, half survival.
Mhm.
I really like It Follows, which is another recent
Yes.
movie that came out.
Very good movie.
Kind
Yeah.
of STD, horror as STDs.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, Let the Right One In, the original Swedish. I really like that. Like that's the kind of horror that I like, where there is some violence, there is some blood. It's more of the concept that is horrific, and a lot of it is about like, it's kind of about. I like the ones where it feels like it's the terror of something that could happen.
It's way more
Um,
psychological
yeah, I'm
and
trying to think like an old
structural,
time one that I
perhaps.
liked. There's a classic Canadian horror film that I watched. I don't know how long ago, but called The Changeling.
Oh, yes.
I'm trying to think of it. It's not Donald Sutherland in it, but it's Patton. I think Patton is in it. Like it's
Is it George C. Scott you're thinking of?
yes, George C. Scott. Yes,
Yeah.
Patton. You know, he doesn't have a real name. It's just the character he played.
Yeah, that's
Um,
right.
yeah, and he's like this, like it's set on a university, Canadian university, and he's kind of like taken a job there, and he's been put into this house that is haunted, and like the scariest moment in that movie is this like Gordon ball, like bouncing down a flight of stairs.
Yeah.
So that that kind of horror that sort of focuses on loss. Like there was, I think it was just called Ghost Story, wasn't it? That came out a few years ago. It was about just the people who die, and they're literally just sheets. They're just white sheets, and it's this ghost in
Which
this
I have not
house,
seen yet. Yep. Okay.
and you see the time of the house go by. Like it's not scary. There's some
It's
scary moments. And then probably the thing I've seen lately in the horror world that I thought was the best was The Haunting of Hill House. Like I really enjoyed that.
the series on Netflix.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was
yeah.
great.
I
Yeah.
thought that was really, yeah, the Netflix series. I know if there are people who really don't like how the source material was adapted. I'm not really familiar to the original source material, so I don't have a dog in that fight, but I just thought that was a really, that did everything in horror that I like horror to do. It made me scared, it made me sad, it made me ask questions, and the jump scare in the second half of that season is, even for me, someone who hates jump scares, like
Yes.
that's like, I had to rewatch it because I was just like, that was so satisfying.
Hmm.
So yeah, I would say like that's kind of what's kind of got me going in the horror world of late. But here's my big thing. My wife is also a horror chicken. And one thing we do
Oh,
when we hear about a horror movie where we're like, oh man, that sounds really, really interesting. Like is don't at me. We will read the Wikipedia page. So
uh-huh.
we kind of know the entirety of the plot. So
Right.
we kind of know when the scares are happening, but Wikipedia is just vague enough that like,
Right.
the witch comes alive. She fights Peter. Peter falls out of a window, is impaled by the fence below. So you know what happens, but like how the witch, like it doesn't give you quite enough detail that it isn't still like a little surprising. It's a double-edged sword because now I'm even more aware. So I'm even more tense because I'm like, oh, Wikipedia told me the witch is going to come alive. But it seems to be right now is the way I can kind of get through these things. I'm so glad my children are not old enough yet to mock me for how what a wuss their dad is, but it's coming. Oh, it's coming.
Oh, yeah. Afraid so, yes. But well, how about horror comedies then? You must like some of those because
Oh, yeah.
they are a little, well, they're, it's not that they're less scary necessarily, but it softens and balances things out, I find anyway. So what are your favorite horror comedies?
I mean, Shaun of the Dead is like a classic.
Yeah.
I mean, that is an absolute classic. I mean, I think they really understand how to do it. I just saw I was on Netflix, Vampires in Brooklyn, which was kind of fun. It's about like gentrification in the or vampires versus the Bronx. Sorry, it's about
Okay,
gentrification in the Bronx and about a bunch of like it's kind of like a Goonies style kind of thing. I
nice.
would say like the Goonies is kind of a horror comedy in many
Yeah,
ways.
actually,
Like it's a kids
or a
horror
genre
comedy.
comedy. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and for kids, so like kind of like Gremlins too. Actually, is
Yes.
a horror comedy. Actually, I consider it definitely a horror comedy.
Actually,
Probably
it's
even
funny.
scarier than the Goonies. So yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's funny actually you mentioned the Gremlins because my mom made me a Mogwai, like a Gizmo costume. My daughter who's 7 is just old enough now to wear it, so like it's just a little big on her, but it would work. And so like we put her into it, and she was like, "Oh, this is great," but she was like, "What is this?" She's like, "I can't wear this if I don't know what it is." And I was like, "Well, it's Gizmo. He's from Mogwai." She's like, "Well, can I see the movie?" And I'm like, "No, no, no, you may not. You're
Too soon.
7." Like I mean, they'd probably eat it up. My like 5-year-old would be like, yeah, but
Yeah.
like I don't know. I'd be the one who'd be like under the counter, like, no, don't feed him after midnight, you fool.
Weirdly, that was the movie that gave me nightmares when I was a kid. I watched Poltergeist when I was 7. I
Really?
watched Nightmare on Elm Street movies when I was young, and I didn't watch The Exorcist until I was like 12
Ooh.
or something like that. But yeah, still, like I had watched plenty of horror movies, and for some reason, Gremlins was the one that got me as far as a nightmare goes. No other horror movie bothered me, and
I
like
think it's
certainly it
because
doesn't
it's like
bother
a
me anymore.
kid is centered in it, right? Like I feel like as a like that movie freaked me out when I was a kid because like I was like that movie like Like it felt like that could be something like your dad could come home and bring you a gift
I
and
guess.
you
Yeah,
go horribly, horribly wrong.
yeah.
I'm trying to
And
think of some. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and of course, but I still loved it. I loved it when I was watching it the first time and subsequent times. But nightmares, man, it was
Oh
real.
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. I'm trying to think of like other ones that I've seen that I like. I mean, I guess
Any
I mean
Canadian?
Zombieland. I mean, if you consider, I mean Zombieland, I
Oh
guess it's like
yes,
more on the comedy side than the
it
horror
is.
side.
It
But I mean,
is.
I
It
find
is.
those movies quite enjoyable. The original What We Do in the Shadows. I don't even know if that's a horror. If that's just comedy that just happens to be
But it
vampires.
has horror characters in it, so it's yeah. I still
Yeah.
consider it horror comedy because it's vampires. The original one and the television series. Love them both. Oh my god.
The Happy Death Day. I've only seen the first one, but I actually really liked that one. I thought I can't
Oh,
remember the lead actress, but I thought she was really strong. I was like, that was actually a much better time than I was expecting. I had kind of downloaded it because I was like, well, I'm on this. I think it was at a comic convention like a couple of years ago, and I was like, I needed something for the flight or whatever, and it was actually pretty entertaining. And then one of my, I don't know if you would consider this a horror. I think it's a horror comedy, but it does a lot of things that I like just because I think it's very smartly written. Is Jennifer's Body. Um,
oh yes, definitely. Yeah.
that's I think that's and I don't know if you consider this a horror comedy, but I think it's Canadian as well, and I think it's great.
Right.
Is Ginger Snaps.
Yeah, actually, a lot of people do consider it horror comedy, and yeah, no, it's definitely got its funny stuff in it. So yeah, I
And
would say
I think Ginger Snaps like that. I think is that's a great movie. I
it's
really,
very well
really
done.
love that. And as a Canadian, it's like one of those ones where I'm like, oh man, I like to stand for that because I'm like, yeah, like I feel like there's probably a lot more great Canadian horror than I realize. I feel like that's something that Canadians are also. We've got that slightly different look at the world. I mean, there was the Pontypool, like
Yes,
the
that was
zombie voice story.
very
Like
funny. Yeah,
there's a lot of quirky, fun horror that comes out of this country. And it's funny because even though I don't really watch a lot of it, I'm always very interested in it. And it's funny when I think now of like the projects I have on the go, how many of them have a horror tinged
mhm.
element to them. I just think that's I don't know. I think maybe it comes from living next door to the States and you know in times like this you look south and you're like, oh
That's
yeah,
a horror story.
the world is so horrific and fright like that's the frightening thing that's lurking under the bed.
Yeah,
In the
totally.
good years you're like, oh, it's not so bad. But every 8 to 10 years you look down there and you're like, oh we're very different people. That scares me.
Yeah, yeah. And yet, and also, what's a little scary is that actually some of us are like them, or we might be a little more like America than we'd like to think too, and that can be
Yes.
scary.
Yeah, well, and that is a very good point, right? It's very easy as Canadians. We're like, oh yeah, look how things are in America. But it's like, if you're an indigenous person in this country, you're like,
Oh yeah, and
yeah, no, it's so much fun here for me. Like, it's so easy. I love it. Going to Winnipeg is my favorite thing to do. Nobody judges me at all, let alone Toronto or any other city, right? So
yeah,
yeah, I think it's a good time as a reminder. I mean, hopefully, not to get all political, but hopefully as Canadians, you're just like, hey, like there's a vast opportunity for us to listen to other people and maybe realize that their experiences of this country are not what we have. I had a friend of mine who one time it was Canada Day. I was like, oh, happy Canada Day. And he kind of flinched. And later we talked about it. He's a person of color. And he was like, yeah, he's like, it means a different thing to me. Right.
hmm,
Like he's like, I love Canada. Like I'm like, this is a country I'm proud of. This is where I was born. But he's like, it does mean something different to me than it does to you. And I was like, yeah, I get that.
yeah,
And we had a very, very amiable and serious conversation on Canada Day, sitting on his porch, just about like what it's like to not be a white dude in
yeah.
Canada, and it was cool. And then switching gears totally, I just thought of another one.
Oh yes.
Such a random thing, and I apologize. But the also Netflix, The Babysitter,
Oh, I haven't seen that yet.
not the sequel, which isn't very good, but the first one. Oh shoot, I'm blanking on her name. She was in the new Bill and Ted movie as well.
I can't help
Uh,
you. Sorry.
it'll come to me later. Anyways, that one, the first one, is actually quite an enjoyable horror comedy. Um,
Nice. Okay.
and again, I apologize that I'm blanking on the lead actress's name, who is the titular babysitter, but she's good in it. She really carries it through. It's a lot of fun just to watch her and the lead character, kind of their relationship and how it goes. It's a fun one for sure.
Awesome, awesome. Well, and on the semi-political and back to the the Netflix note, I know I have to let you go. So thank you so much for chatting with me today, Conor. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thanks so much, Reagan. And if people are interested in learning more about what I do, you can always check
Yes.
me out on Facebook. You can look me up on Kill Shakespeare or Conor McCreery. I also have a Twitter, which is Kill Shakespeare or Conor McCreery, which is one N. And if you just want pictures of my kids, my Instagram is The Real Conor. There you go. That's all I got. That's all I got for you.
And I'll
But
have that
yeah,
info and links in the blog too, so people can
excellent.
just, yeah, you don't have to
Thanks so
remember
much,
that.
Reagan. It's really so nice to see you again.
Yes, thank you, Conor.